And so it makes it nice because now as I step into this role and step into that clinical side, I really feel like, okay, well, I know how much work has gone into us just getting to this point. And now like seeing it actually, help somebody recover from an injury or deal with a neurological disease is that much more rewarding.
I'm Garrett Salpeter, and I believe that the most powerful and transformative way to help people recover from pain and injury, heal from trauma, and reach their highest levels of fitness and performance is to focus on the nervous system. In this podcast, we'll share knowledge from the frontiers of neuroscience and inspirational stories of how applying that knowledge has empowered people from all walks of life to heal, adapt, and grow. Welcome to this episode of the Undercurrent podcast. I am very excited to have this conversation with Dr. Ramona von Leden. She is a PhD neuroscientist who has a very interesting history in academic research, some of which she'll share with us here. And then about 6 months ago, she joined our team as NeuFit's first ever Director of Research. So she is officially Director of Research and Clinical Education, and I'm excited to dive in here and give some insights into our research program and life in academia and all of it. So thanks for being here, Ramona.
Yeah, thank you, Garrett. I'm very excited to join you on the podcast and explore what we've been working on, what I've done before, and the interesting questions in between.
Yes, well, let's start with some of the what you've done before, because obviously you have had a very interesting career, or maybe not obvious to our listeners yet, but it will be soon. Had a very interesting career, and there was a lot of overlap. So when we first met and you were telling me about your research, I was immediately intrigued. I had light bulbs going off, saw the overlap between your work and our work and our interests here. And so can you just give listeners an overview of what you had been doing in your career before we started working together?
Yeah, absolutely. So my background, I have a PhD in neuroscience, but within that, neuroscience is really a gigantic field at this point. I focused my research efforts on traumatic injury to the nervous system and the inflammatory processes, and then how age plays into that for recovery. So that included both spinal cord injury and traumatic brain injury. My graduate work was on basically what age you get an injury, how that changes your inflammatory response and recovery. And then when I went on to do a little of my postdoctoral work, I worked on traumatic brain injury and the immune response and how that influences similarly, your recovery, cognitive impairments, outcomes from that aspect. But all of this stemmed from earlier work and earlier interests that I had. So I grew up an athlete. I played Division I softball at Brown University, and then was lucky enough that kind of figured out while I was at Brown that neuroscience was really exciting to me and interesting. And my mom at the time, who had been a law enforcement officer for about 20 years, had suffered a spinal cord injury in the course of her job, and was on crutches for about a dozen years. And she was really frustrated because every time she'd speak to the physicians, they would say, you've got to have surgery and you have to do a fusion, and you're never really going to be able to walk without crutches again. And she couldn't accept it because she's super active and runs a farm now, but neither could I. I was like, no, I think we can make some progress here. And I know the research is out there that can push this forward, and we can find better solutions than just fusing all of your vertebrae together and limiting your mobility for the rest of your life. And so that really, certainly, when you apply to grad school and they're like, well, why do you want to do this? Absolutely. That was such a huge part of why I decided to study spinal cord injury. But it also was a fascinating area of study. And I think one of the kind of more straightforward in terms of neuroscience as well. A lot of the questions in neuroscience are very, cognitive based. Mm-hmm. Asking questions about spinal cord injury, your outcome measures are really straightforward. It's can this person walk? Can they not walk? Are they able to have autonomic function? So it makes it a little bit cleaner of a question. It's also a smaller field, which as a grad student is great because you have to come up with something that's totally new and independent. It's a lot easier when the field is small. But I found it to be a super interesting and fascinating area to work in because kind of the sky was the limit. So I joined a lab. I did my graduate work at Uniformed Services University, which is the military's medical school. And that added another element to this continuing interest in like helping people recover from injury was that then my grad school was literally on the Walter Reed Navy Medical Base. So I was walking past Walter Reed Hospital every single day to go to the lab, and I was seeing people who had been injured in combat and people who'd been dealing with injuries for years. I was swimming at, the Navy pool with these guys who had lost their limbs or had an injury. And so it was like the most motivating factor ever to keep working on, like, okay, can we find and identify interesting targets for therapies that would actually help people to be able to improve their recovery? So all kismet that like after many years of working in that area, then we met, and you're that one step closer to working with the patient, right? Like, or you are working with the patient and using a device that I think, because it's non-invasive, offers a lot more opportunities for regular therapies and less scary therapies. For someone like my mom, who was like, I don't want to have a major surgery, I would like to try other things first, and she wasn't being given a lot of options. Having something that's non-invasive that can help to work on different aspects of an injury is, wonderful. And like, that's the ideal situation. Mm-hmm. So, yeah.
That's awesome. Thank you for that overview. And I agree with you. That's a huge point about having something that's low risk, that's non-invasive. For a little bit of education for our listeners, one of the things you mentioned as part of your career is that you were looking at the effects of age and inflammation and immune markers on the severity and recovery of injury. So this is really interesting. The first time I learned this, it was really surprising to me that to summarize, essentially a lot of the damage in a spinal cord injury is not necessarily from the original trauma as much as it is from the body's immune inflammatory reaction. The collateral damage from the inflammatory response can actually be part of the damage. So can you, for the education of our listeners, can you talk a little bit about what you found in your research and the relevance of inflammation to the outcomes in spinal cord injury?
Definitely. So it's kind of two-pronged. One is what you spoke to, which is that the inflammatory response in general can often kind of go haywire, especially in the case of nervous system injury. So one thing that most people wouldn't know is that the nervous system has a higher ratio of inflammatory cells to neurons, specifically the spinal cord, than the brain, and even within just the nervous system itself, that's a higher ratio than you have in your peripheral system. So when there's an injury, there's sort of tends to be an over-response. And that makes sense evolutionarily, because your inflammatory response is your first response to an injury. It's what kind of surrounds the trauma and surrounds the injured area, and then says, okay, like, we need to like protect all of that healthy tissue from what's going on here. So you have your immune cells, your inflammatory cells, they all come in and they build this beautiful glial scar around the injury. But then the problem is that they also release a lot of factors that, in the case of something like a traumatic brain or spinal cord injury, are really hard to kind of like, it's like once they've been unleashed, it's hard to bring them back in, because they all kind of work in a feedback loop. So what tends to happen with, especially spinal cord injury, is that the trauma itself obviously is going to cause damage. You're going to see it, you'll see the injury site. But over time, that injury site just keeps growing, because the inflammatory cells are actually, essentially, they're trying to eat away all the bad tissue and protect the healthy tissue. But in reality, what ends up happening is that keeps going, and it becomes a chronic process where normally your inflammatory cells, they sort of exist in three different states. And this will lead into sort of my work with aging. So the most exciting inflammatory cells in my mind, because this is what I researched, are microglia. And microglia are, they're the responders. They go in and they like respond to it, and they're phagocytes. So they like eat up that really bad dead tissue, and then they send signals to other cells, like your glial cells, which are more structural, and they come in and form that scar and help to like protect the region. But microglia, normally they're kind of like, they're just hanging out like in the cellular environment in general, and they exist in a quiescent state, which essentially means they're observing. They're like, nothing's going on, I'm just gonna hang out. They kind of look like little blobs, but then when there's an injury, they get a little angry, is the way we call them, and they get bigger, and like, you know, they have these processes that are out checking on the cell sites all the time. And when they get angry, those processes come in, they go to the injury site and they attack. But that like activated state, which they're in, is the one that's hard to come back from. So once they're activated, like it's kind of like they're too excited, like they're hyper excitable. And so as long as there's still something there, they keep chewing away. And that's why you see kind of this continuing problem. And like, as I said, it becomes a feedback loop where, because you have this chronic activation of these cells, it just keeps kind of chipping away, and that becomes really hard to work with to recover.
And when you say there's a higher ratio of immune cells to neurons in the spinal cord than anywhere else in the nervous system, is it those microglia?
For the most part, yeah. It's definitely a higher ratio of microglia. There's also some glial cells that are higher too, but the glial cells really aren't considered the ones that cause the problem. Glial cells are a little bit, you know, they're kind of the nice inflammatory cells. And what's interesting, especially about these cells, is they're not bad or good. There used to kind of be this idea that like microglia are the bad ones and like glial cells are the good ones. No, like they're all good. We need them. There's a reason they function. But with the microglia, they can either release pro-inflammatory factors, which are going to kind of exacerbate the situation, or they can release anti-inflammatory factors, which in theory should also, you know, should help to calm things down. And so in a perfect situation, if you have an injury and they're responding the way they should, they release pro-inflammatory factors at the beginning, right, to like acutely deal with the problem. But then as the problem subsides, they start to release the anti-inflammatory factors, they interact with the other cells, they communicate, and that inflammation dies down. Like I said, our system's not perfect, and sometimes that doesn't happen, and those factors just keep producing and, you know, kind of circling back to themselves.
So they're not necessarily good or bad, they're useful, but you can have too much of a good thing. And if they're too active for too long, then that, of course, if they're cleaning up debris and they're eating up tissue, then there can be too much of that if they start, you know, breaking down healthy tissue.
Exactly.
And expanding that area of damage.
Yeah, and actually I remember this, there was a little bit of research that was coming out around the time that I was finishing my thesis that was suggesting that like we'd always kind of thought of it as like pro-inflammatory factors are bad, anti-inflammatory factors are good, and there was starting to become evidence that was showing some of these anti-inflammatory factors weren't doing great stuff either. So it all depends, and if it's left to kind of run wild, that becomes a problem. And so where this becomes really interesting with aging is that age in general, like, sad to say, aging is not great. And what tends to happen, so after about mid-40s, in general, our DNA starts to mutate. We start to see changes in the cells that just are natural, it's normal, but they tend to impact things like the inflammatory system. And in one way that we see it is for these microglia and glial cells and all of the cells in the immune response, they take on sort of a primed state is the way to think about them. So they're not totally active, but they're not like relaxed and observant. And so if then an injury is introduced to that system, they hyper respond. And again, this is an idea that really should make good sense, and it makes sense evolutionarily in that because you're older and your system is not functioning quite as effectively, as your DNA mutates, things like your ability to process reactive oxygen species goes down. Those are really like, you know, as you're processing oxygen and, you know, kind of taking oxygen, breaking it apart and making it useful to your cells and useful for fuel, you also produce, you know, it's kind of a byproduct are these reactive oxygen species. And if you've ever been told like you should eat a lot of antioxidants, like that's why. Like antioxidants help to process those reactive oxygen species and get them out of your system, which is why if you're older, like great idea, eat lots of antioxidants because your body's just not naturally capable of handling them as well as when you were younger. But that leads to these cells kind of like, it's almost like they're grumpy, right? Like as they get older, just like, you know, lots of people tend to get a little grumpier as they get older. They like are kind of these grumpy cells and they're hanging out. They're like, get off my lawn. And so like when an injury comes in and gets on it, then they like, you know, overreact and they're screaming at the kids off the lawn instead of just being like, hey man, could just take it on the other side of the street. But that, and then the injury compounds. So one of the things I looked at in my research was literally the size of injury and how age affects the size of that injury, and like is it in the short term and then in the long term. And so if you look at a spinal cord injury in someone who's a younger age, you know, you have your injury site, and yes, it does grow a little bit over time, but because the body's able to kind of fight back, it will eventually kind of close up. If you look at someone who's older and they have a spinal cord injury, right away when it happens, it looks really similar in terms of that lesion and that size of the injury to someone younger. But if you look at it 30 days out, it's spread so like significant amount more than it did when you were younger. And that's because those cells are just, they're overreacting, they're over-responding, and they can't get under control. So that's unfortunately. And
so you were able to quantify the degree to which that excess immune activity actually quantifiably increases the size of the spinal cord injury damage, the damage zone. When you talk about how DNA mutates with aging and things like that, I can't help but wonder if it is age or if there's things, and this may be a little outside of your area of research, but can't help but think about some of these strategies around telomeres and aging, or different lifestyle strategies that we can do. I can't just wonder if it's aging, if it's the passage of time, or if it's what we do during that time, and if there's anything that you've seen that quantifiably reduces those types of mutations. Because generally speaking, regardless of whether we have a spinal cord injury or anything, just for general health, like, we don't want to have a ton of extra inflammatory activity just because, as we get older. So is there anything that you're aware of that can move the needle in terms of minimizing these mutations and reducing the risks of having more inflammatory activity as we age?
Yes and no. As you said, certainly not something that I will say with 100% certainty, but I love the hypothetical and love talking through it. So in terms of, there is an essence of, there is some nature that we can't really, prevent, that is going to say, like, we are going to see some changes that are normal mutations. Mutations don't always necessarily have to be bad. It's just the cells are changing because you've been alive a long time. At the same time, obviously lifestyle plays a huge factor in how much mutation you're having and what kind of mutations you're seeing. So if you are living a healthier lifestyle, if you're regularly active, if you are, you don't have to be super strict on what you're eating, but if you're conscious of the food you're eating, if you're thinking about things like, am I making sure to get enough fuel that's going to help with antioxidants, if you're thinking about those things, that's going to support your body to be able to sort of take care of those mutations a little bit, right? Cell turnover happens all the time and is constant, and we are lucky that we now know that we used to think that the brain, once it was developed, that was it, like you were done. No, neuroplasticity continues for the rest of your life, so you can continue to make new cells. And so if you're able to support the system to make new healthy cells, that's also going to play a really big factor. One thing that sort of at the tail end of my dissertation work, I started to dig into, and always kind of wish that like I'd had the time to keep going, but you want to finish and get on with your career, was considering changes in glucose metabolism. So, and it's something that's a really simple idea, but we do see as you age, glucose metabolism tends to be one of those things that mutates, and you're not quite as efficient with how you metabolize your glucose. Usually that manifests, and obviously people have a harder time keeping weight off, even if they're active, even if they're healthy. But we have tools that we've had for a long time, right, with diabetics, with insulin, that can help to support your glucose metabolism. So insulin resistance is one of the most common things we see, especially like in Alzheimer's disease and neurodegeneration. You see insulin resistance of those cells. And so using something as simple as insulin to support those cells, you can actually improve cognitive function. You can improve metabolism and how somebody's generally feeling, because those cells basically are not getting enough fuel, and if you can just give them access. So one of the coolest things, and that's why I say I'm all about non-invasive therapies. If we don't, if you don't have to have a shot, if you don't have to have a surgery, like let's do it, because that's your body will also not have to deal with the trauma of that extra additional factor, which is something you talk a lot about on this podcast and in general in this work, is intranasal therapies. So one of the grad students who worked in my lab, her thesis work was literally looking at, can we use intranasal insulin as a treatment for traumatic brain injury? And traumatic brain injury is essentially a neurodegenerative disease. The pathology of it looks very similar to Alzheimer's disease. So you can, they go hand in hand. Like if you can use it for TBI, which is traumatic brain injury, you can use it for Alzheimer's disease. And right as I was leaving, we were starting to write a grant, which my old boss did get, and I'm very excited to see what papers come out from that work, which was then saying, can we use it for spinal cord injury? Well, intranasal insulin actually, can that insulin get far enough through? You are circulating in the nervous system constantly throughout the cerebrospinal fluid, but would that also help? And part of that is that glucose metabolism plays into inflammatory cells. Like they're very interconnected. I am perhaps biased, but I do think a lot of things come back to inflammation. And so if you can support the system in different ways that help to sort of provide, the information that the inflammatory cells need to calm down, that can be a really great way, and possibly a non-invasive way to help prevent some of the more unfortunate side effects of aging.
If you're ready to supercharge your practice, listen to this. Garrett and Team NeuFit have just released a new online course entitled Introduction to the NeuFit Method. In this detailed 8-hour course, you'll gain mastery of the fundamental techniques in our practice, including muscle testing and activations, nerve glides, and joint articulations. You'll also get introduced to our patented direct current stimulation device, the Newbie, an incredible machine that's empowered professionals just like you to help their patients heal, adapt, and grow faster than they ever thought possible. To learn more, go to www.neu.fit/learn. And now back to the show.
Well, I love that you touched on these what I perceive to be the two biggest factors in general health and wellness and healthy aging, and those being metabolic health and inflammation.
Yeah.
And those are just metabolically, thinking about do we have enough energy to get through our day? Do we need to rely on stimulants? How are we sleeping? Do we wake up feeling rested? Can our metabolism support our daily life? If so, good, and we have energy left over to take care of these longer term growth and repair projects. If not, if we can barely get through our day without, a high sugar, high caffeine something in the afternoon, or, I think that's indicative of issues, and that usually, that can be happening for months or years before more serious issues, but it's like an indicator, it's a warning light going off.
Yeah, and I do think there are a lot of ways that we know already, but also that are kind of on the, still on the side of the research side, to support our body to do those things so that we can live a healthier life. Nutrition really is a huge factor in that, right? It's what you are eating, what you're providing to your body, hydration, all of that is going to make you feel significantly different. Sleep is the other one. I certainly have had a lot of conversations with my mom and my stepdad, because they were both law enforcement, so they had really weird sleep schedules for a really long time. And I was like, no, you don't understand. If you don't get good sleep, that can contribute to your risk for neurodegenerative disease. Sleep is so essential to recovery and to doing that work of taking all, the buildup of activity that we have in our cells every day and washing it out and resetting your body. Sleep is so key. So yeah, if there's one big take home, sleep more.
Amen. That's a good one. I would love to continue our science conversation here, but we'll try to switch gears for a little bit. And I'm really curious to hear again your perspective and share with our listeners your perspective on the differences and similarities between academic research, when you were in a university-based lab, and then the, clinical business world, the type of research that we're doing over here. Can you just kind of share your perspective on the similarities and differences, and then also what motivated you to make that jump?
Ooh, that's a long question. Absolutely. So I think they both are super important in terms of pushing science forward. Academic research is the more traditional research, right? It's kind of what people think of when they think of somebody working in a lab and doing scientific research. And sometimes the nice thing about academic research is often you're doing research for the sake of research. It's, there are different funding agencies. There's the National Science Foundation, and then there's the National Institute of Health, which tend to be the two big groups that people get academic funding from. National Science Foundation literally is science for the sake of science. They do not have like a health spin on it at all. Whereas if you get your funding from the National Institute of Health, it is, you have to be doing research that in some way relates to a health problem. And so that, it feels great to be doing it because you want to improve and help the world. But ultimately, sometimes that can make things go a little slower because there is less pressure to produce. I mean, there's certainly academics has its pressure in terms of publishing. There's always the kind of terminology if you're a faculty member that you have to publish or perish. But it is a more relaxed environment in terms of pushing progress forward, in terms of getting products out. Whereas on sort of the more commercial side, on the business side, you're doing research because you have an idea in mind, right? Like you have a project, you have something, you have a device that you want to prove can work with things like we're doing. And so you're doing the research to support what you hope you're able to say your device is doing, or to put a product out there that's going to be directly going to consumers. And so they interplay in a lot of ways, but I think the big thing is, right, like as I thought about it, I was in academic research for about 12, 13 years. I was like, okay, I'm doing the framework. Like the stuff I'm doing is the groundwork that then, the next group of people is going to take in that next step. And we kind of think of it as preclinical to translational to clinical research. So preclinical is bench work. You're working, with the cells, with the molecules. And then that information that you learn there is going to jump to the translational research, which is, okay, like that's what somebody who's perhaps at a pharmaceutical company or at a biotech is going to be looking at. Like, how can we take that information this person learned at the bench and actually implement it and create products and create tools that are going to be used in the clinical setting by a physician or whatever that aspect happens to be. And so I think that the benefit of being in the business side is that because you have this need to make products and to get your to make I'm blanking on the word. It's okay.
Commercialize
and to have to make sales essentially. That competition with the other people in your field kind of drives you to produce better things. It's the smaller, better, faster model that's always seen in tech. So that competition, it's a good thing. It's making us, work harder to come up with a better solution to the same problems. Monetizing something isn't bad. Like you should get paid for all that time and effort you've put into it. And really when it comes back to it, like academic research is also small business. So in an academic lab, like everything functions off of grant funding. So a lab is run by, a professor who has to get grants to pay for the research and to pay the people that they employ. So it's like a microcosm. I mean, they kind of try to make you feel like you're not doing it for the money, but like if you don't have funding, you can't do the research. So ultimately, we're all kind of functioning on the same model. It's just with a different end goal in mind, right? So academic work, it's how do we produce information that's going to support the next phase. In business, you're now taking that information and delivering on that next phase. And so for me, I've done that sort of framework and bench work for so long that I was really ready to get a little bit closer to the production of something, to working, seeing the products actually help people. And so it makes it nice because now as I step into this role and step into that clinical side, I really feel like, okay, well, I know how much work has gone into us just getting to this point. And now like seeing it actually, help somebody recover from an injury or deal with a neurological disease is that much more rewarding.
That's awesome. It's cool just to see the evolution of your own career and perspective, and I'm just really grateful that it worked out, timing wise, for us to be able to work together, and
it was kismet.
And for this to be kind of the next chapter in your career. So on that topic, can you share with everybody who's listening here some of the research initiatives that we have going on that you are leading here at NeuFit?
Yeah, so I think the exciting thing for us is that we've officially launched our research program. I will say officially as of February 2021. Mm-hmm. And what that entails is a lot of different things. So again, sort of speaking to what's different about my life in academia versus commercial, is that there's less limits here. So we have, I think we have 6 active studies, and they're all very different from each other, and they all serve different purposes. So we're running our first in-house study, which is super exciting, and that's a partnership between the NeuBee and BioStrap Labs, and we're looking at biometrics of, looking at autonomic nervous system biometrics, as well as, things that you would normally measure, like heart rate, sleep scores, et cetera, in terms of...
And blood flow.
Right.
Vascular function, yeah.
Arterial function, and how that is impacted by working with the NeuBee on a regular basis. And so, that asks a couple of questions. One, if you are on a NeuBee for an acute injury and you're maybe working with it regularly for a month, are we going to see a difference? And is that going to last after you perhaps stop working with it because your injury has gotten better? Or if we're approaching it from sort of just general health and recovery, are you seeing changes in really important things like sleep that are going to benefit just cellular function and general health in the day-to-day? Which I think will be really exciting and speak a lot to, how this technology is improving people's lives. And then in the more clinical realm, we've got a couple of studies with physical therapy clinics, Health in Motion in Wisconsin, as well as Orthopedic One in Ohio, who are really looking at, very specific clinical outcomes. So if a practitioner is working with these devices, are they going to be able to get their patients back to health faster? And can we clinically quantify that, improve that? Are their patients going to feel better, not just, get them walking faster or whatever that particular issue is, but are they actually feeling better, feeling more mobile, feeling more excited to be doing this work? And are they satisfied with their treatment, which are all important things to, the patients and the physical therapists, and certainly speak to, the usefulness of a device like the NeuBee. And then we have more academic work as well. We have an awesome study at University of South Florida, which I won't even get into too much because you did cover that in a previous podcast with Sam Buckner, who's the lead primary investigator on that. But essentially trying to look at that more scientific aspect, what exactly is the NeuBee doing? Is it, when we look at it in training, are we actually increasing muscle size? Are we actually increasing blood flow, which is allowing muscles to work a little bit better? What are those cellular changes that we're seeing when we use it for training? And all of those are going to play into our understanding, of course, of how to use the NeuBee, but then what it can be used for. And then before we wrap up sort of current studies, we're now just starting 2 studies that look at neurological disease, which to me, of course, again, bias, I'm most excited about. But I think that electrical stimulation devices in general, there's a lot of data out there that shows that they work for physical therapy. I think the NeuBee is doing it a little different, but that's not a surprise to anyone that we are getting good responses using electrical stimulation in physical therapy. Neurological disease, on the other hand, is a much more complicated question. And so if we can start showing patient outcomes that we're actually able to help people who have chronic neurological conditions and again, quantify it in the clinic, that's huge. So we have, we're doing a pilot study on multiple sclerosis and looking at spasticity and how we can actually see if we can improve patient spasticity in regular at-home usage of the NeuBee. We are also working on a stroke study, and I think that's probably going to play in a lot into vestibular issues and balance from what I've heard from our partners at Baylor Scott and White, that's what they see a lot, is that one of the biggest issues coming out of a stroke is balance issues and feeling comfortable, walking without assistance. So can we get people back, balanced using that electrical stimulation, and especially with direct current, using different polarity and actually being able to, help people sort of reset that system would be amazing.
Specifically on the vestibular system, right?
Yes, yeah. Reset their actual balance through the vestibular system.
And then neuropathy too.
And then we've got something
hot off the press
that potential that we're going to be discussing tomorrow.
That's right. That's right. Yeah,
is a potential study for neuropathies. So I think the exciting thing is every one of those studies is wildly different. But that also just shows you the sky's the limit kind of, and what we can do. And that's exciting because I think as we start to get the data from these studies, that's also going to guide us in our next step. So it's what's working, what's not working, where is a lot of promise, and then let's dive forward on that. But yeah, the cool thing for me is stepping into this role is wow, there's so many opportunities here because there's so little out there on these topics, and we are asking questions that other people aren't asking. At both the academic level and at the commercial level. So we're going to make a huge impact with our research study. I certainly hope that we will, but I think we will.
I like that. And we also the Piazza Center.
Oh yeah.
Another one here.
Yes, I should certainly not forget that one. I think that's probably one of the more straightforward studies we have, in that electrical stimulation has been shown in studies to be helpful for post-surgical wound healing. But our question here is, so we have a fantastic plastic surgeon in Austin, Rocco Piazza, who works with women who have tummy tucks. And usually your recovery from a tummy tuck takes 3 to 6 months. It kind of involves just not moving much, which really, is largely due to just the surgical healing. It's not necessarily, your body's, again, surgery is a trauma to the body. So we're now going to look at... And
sometimes the body overreacts in the same way as we were talking about earlier.
Especially in the case of that. Inflammation is off the charts. So you developed a great training protocol that we're going to map out and work with patients who come out of a tummy tuck to see if we can shorten that time, if we can start to get them actually moving much sooner, which not only is that great for them in terms of recovery, if you come out of surgery and you don't do anything, that's not going to help you get better if you've got movement issues. But a lot of times you don't feel good, so you can't do anything. So even just using passive electrical stimulation in those first couple weeks, if that makes people feel stronger, they have less pain, and then you can start training and actually, build things back better than they were before the surgery, and faster. That's the goal anyway.
Yes. I'm excited for these to really be able to, measure, quantify, identify the outcomes that we've seen, anecdotally, the case studies and things like that, and really, measure the effect size and look at it with more rigorous scientific eyes.
Yeah.
I'm just really excited to see the outcomes here. We should have data collection completed on a few studies this year, and then, more next year. And I'm just really excited to see the program grow underneath your leadership.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I think science takes time. So a lot of these things are underway, but I can't wait. We're going to start having data coming in. Yeah, like I said, several studies should be done by this year, which means we can really start to then, shift focus and look to what's going to be the next projects and where we go next with this data and how we use it, both, for commercial benefits, but also to put out into the field and to help other people who are working in these areas, whether those are other clinicians or other companies that maybe we partner with instead of compete with. But yeah, we're right at the beginning, the precipice of all of this data, which is the kind of very exciting time. I'm excited to get the data, and then I'll come back on the podcast and we can talk about it.
Amen. I'm excited for the part 2.
Yeah. So give us 6 months to get at least a few of these studies done, and then we'll do part 2 updates.
Yes, that's right. So if people want to follow you, I got to ask you to share your Instagram handle.
Oh gosh. So my Instagram handle is In the Zona with Ramona. It's a silly one, but it was a nickname given to me by a friend a long time ago, and it stuck. So
yes, and if you do follow Ramona or any of her work, you may also see that she is a very highly regarded kickboxing coach. Yeah. And I got to go to her class. Bree and I, my wife and I, went to her class. It was fun.
Yeah, you looked like you had a lot of fun.
So it was great. Yeah, you are a woman of many talents.
Oh, so. Thank you. I know for those of you listening, you can't see it, but I'm definitely blushing.
Well, thank you so much for being on the episode, sharing some of your career history, research interests, and then perspective on making the jump from academia into more of that, clinical setting here, and then sharing the overview on the research projects we have going on. I'm really feeling confident and optimistic in our research program. I think we're gonna learn a lot. I think we're gonna be able to share a lot of valuable information, and I'm really excited to see how it evolves. So
yeah, me too.
Thank you for being a part of our team and being on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
And thank you everybody for tuning in and listening. This is the Undercurrent Podcast. Thank you so much for listening to the Undercurrent Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving a review and be sure to subscribe to stay up to date as we release future episodes.